Thank you very much. And thank you very much to everybody for making today's event possible. I very much look forward to the whole day. In 1622 to 23, following his defeat, the library of the Elector Palatine was transported to the Vatican, where the overwhelming majority of the Palatine manuscripts still are. Part of the collection was transferred to Paris in 1797. With the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, 846 manuscripts, a small portion of the whole library, returned to Heidelberg. The post-Napoleon settlement is sometimes described as a turning point in the change of attitudes to the looting of cultural goods. However, the treaties of Paris of 1814 and 1815 do not mention the return of cultural objects, which was therefore contested at every stage by the restored French monarchy. A question mark about the change of attitude is also raised by the very limited return of Palatine manuscripts. The Vatican insisted that the Palatine Library had been legitimately acquired in a just war, in contrast to Napoleon's unjust war of aggression, and it was therefore not prepared to face any legal claim, but prepared to make a donation. If attitudes didn't change around 1814-15, they certainly have now. And those of us who work in institutions know that we now see many more demands for the return of objects. We are the heirs of a complex past. There is sometimes a feeling of decision-making in this area being surrounded by disquiet and distrust. All parties have to negotiate a field characterized by different approaches to the past and thus to cultural property. One, broadly speaking, one based in existing legal principles and one broadly driven by ethics. This is new, and a number of basic principles remain unclear. And this creates a situation where it's easy for settlements to be or to seem to be incoherent, leaving claimants, those from whom claims are made, and a wider public dissatisfied. I will briefly outline 6 areas of unresolved tension. They form the structure of my presentation. I address these points not as a lawyer, but as a citizen concerned both with ethical solutions and with the rule of law, and as a person who's had experience in working with collections which raise complex moral and legal issues. My first point is about retrospectivity. It's only in the last 30 years or so that cultural property in most countries has been emerging as a separate legal category. Crimes against cultural property are still narrowly circumscribed, and most theft of cultural property is considered like any other theft. The law is far from having changed as much as significant parts of public opinion. It is a principle of justice that law should not be retrospective, potentially penalizing people for acts that were legal when they were undertaken. But retrospective legislation is not unknown. In the UK, for instance, the War Crimes Act of 1991 is retrospective. Now, it is broadly accepted that the destruction of the culture of a group of people is an integral part of war crimes. Consequently, it's not so strange that to many people it seems right that acts relating to cultural property should also be judged by according to laws, norms, and attitudes contemporary with us, rather than those which were in force when the acts took place. A discrepancy between legislation and widespread but not universal perceptions of what is just creates a complex field within which institutions have to make decisions about potentially contested cultural property in their collection. How far should retroactivity reach? How far back in history to the 30 Years' War? What level of unacceptability should be associated with an alienation in order for retroactivity to apply? And should it only apply to cultural property? Why not to any other type of property gained through a now unacceptable activity? Would the ability to benefit from the retroactivity only apply to people who can be seen as victims of unacceptable oppression, or to everybody? Even more challenging, perhaps, is the question why retroactivity should not also apply to objects in private ownership. If this is based on an ethical consideration, why not also private? Until we can formulate widely acceptable answers to questions like these, decision-making in this area is bound to be unsatisfactory to many. My second point of tension arises because there's no shared understanding about the appropriate standard of proof when assessing the past of an object. In a course of law, in criminal cases, at least in the UK and the US, a prosecutor will have to prove the guilt of an accused beyond reasonable doubt, otherwise the jury should acquit. There is widespread agreement that proof beyond reasonable doubt is an unreasonably high standard of proof to demand from a claimant for the return of cultural property. Without saying what standard of proof should be applied, the Washington Principles for the Return of Nazi Confiscated Art suggests that consideration should be given to unavoidable gaps or ambiguities in the provenance in the light of passage of time and the circumstances of the Holocaust era. And would it not only seem fair if analogous considerations should be extended to claims of other types? Yet, by contrast, at the same time also changing the burden of proof, the EU regulations for import of cultural goods demand that importers must prove the legality of the object in question. In a civil court, in a common law system at least, a judge will decide on the ownership of an object on the basis of the balance of probability. If there is 51% chance that an object is the property of a person, the judge will allocate it to them. To a historian, that's a shockingly low level of standard for making a decision about the past. And the potential for this standard of proof to provide an unsatisfactory result is illustrated by the case of Van Gogh's haystack. It had been spoliated from two owners, one after the other, but a court can only allocate it to one or the other party. This seemed too risky to both claimants. So therefore they agreed out of court to share the proceeds of the sale of the watercolor. So among claimants, there can be good reasons to find that decisions based on the balance of probability are too risky. Yet, for instance, in the UK, the Spoliation Advisory Committee makes its recommendations on the basis of the balance of probability. Holders of a claimed item are therefore faced with a situation where the standards of proof applied to them is one which could be perceived as being too risky if the dispute were between claimants. When assessing a potential acquisition, institutions ought to exercise due diligence. They may decline a purchase if there's just a reasonable doubt about its provenance. This is normally based on a risk assessment, and that only means that the risk associated with an object is assessed to be too high for the institution. It doesn't constitute a real decision about the past of the object. This creates a situation where an institution may reasonably apply one set of criteria to items in its existing collection and another set of criteria to items which it considers to acquire. This difference is not always readily understood, and this can cause dissatisfaction to claimants as well as to members of the trade. In my professional life, I've been accused by members of the trade of assuming guilt until innocence is proven. So with at least 5 different complex and often not explicit standards of assessing the past of an object, it isn't strange that there's a lack of agreement about what would be appropriate under which circumstances. This lack of clarity easily leads to dissatisfaction and unease amongst all sides. The standard of probability used, for instance, by the UK spoliation panel is linked to its obligation to give due weight to the moral strength of the claimant's case. This is my third point of unresolved tension. Norman Palmer has argued cogently why both moral considerations and legal considerations ought to be relevant in matters relating to cultural heritage. He also sought to ease the tension between law and ethics, not least by suggesting that alternative dispute resolutions should be found because legal solutions and litigation are inadequate, unpredictable, and expensive. However, it's not obvious what constitutes the moral strength of a case. Debbie Girolamo has suggested that this exemplifies more broadly a confusion between morality and the fair and just settlement required by the Washington Principles. There, the fair and just settlement comes after it's been proved that an item was spoliated and from whom. That's consistent with the observation of Charlotte Woodhead that the moral strength of a claim does not derive from the deprived owner's acquisition or ownership, but from the repugnant circumstances of its loss. Moral strength is thus linked to the manner in which a proven loss should be compensated, not to the assessment of the validity of a claim of ownership. Now, we know that it's hard to document the circumstances under which owners were deprived of their possessions, and also that there can be a semblance of consent where the owner had no real option but to cede their property. However, taking this into account is not a moral issue, but a balance of probability issue. It is simply because under specific conditions, some things are inherently more likely than others. Or as Leonard Hoffman, a senior UK judge, put it would need more cogent advice to satisfy one that the creature seen walking in Regent's Park was more likely than not to have been a lioness than to be satisfied to the same standard of probability that it was an Alsatian. Although not a moral consideration, this flexibility allows for compensation circumstances which increase the likelihood that an owner ceded their possession without genuine consent. Again, this consideration surely should be applicable far beyond the arena of Nazi spoliation. Yet, perceptions about the fairness of a decision about ownership are often based in the repugnance of the very broad circumstances of deprivation in a period, and this can have an impact on decisions. For instance, in his decision about the Beneventon Missal, where there was no suggestion that it had been removed from its previous owner in morally repugnant circumstances, the UK's panel recommended that it should be returned, and that seems to be influenced by the moral strength of the claimed, based in the religious and cultural importance of the missal to the claimant. This recommendation of the spoliation panel thus exemplifies the unresolved question of what constitutes moral strength and when it is applicable. If moral strength can overrule legal ownership in a public institution, again seems difficult to understand why it would not also apply in private ownership. But here, the public support might be much less strong, and there would probably be a conflict with the peaceful enjoyment of one's possession guaranteed by the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights. Woodhead has pointed out that the UK panel can take this non-legal matter into account because its recommendations are not legally binding. That is true, but it would be extremely unwise for an institution not to follow a recommendation endorsed by its ministry. In practice, it is politically too risky not to consent. This again suggests that there is an unresolved tension between law and morality. Now, I'm confident that policy plays no part in the decision of the UK spoliation panel, but generically, and also far beyond the UK, a lack of clarity about the role of moral considerations opens for the possibility of a decision being made because it is politically expedient. At the same time, the lack of clarity about how moral strength relates to a fair and just settlement, under what historical events it's applicable, and its impact on the standard of proof contributes to creating an understandable expectation on behalf of claimants that certain principles are applicable even when this is not legally possible. This leads to a perception very often that justice is not being done. My fourth point of unresolved tension concerns the burden of proof. Normally, you'd expect the burden of proof to fall on the claimant, not necessarily in restitution cases. In the UK, the burden of proof was reversed when it comes to import of cultural property from Iraq. Although this was questioned whether it was compatible with the European Convention for Human Rights. In the report on African art, Felwine Sarr and Benedict Savoy reversed the burden of proof. It's up to museums to prove that an item is legally theirs. If they cannot, the item should be returned. This seems to rest on the view that the colonial experience was so marked by violence and by an unequitable distribution of power that free and equitable trade was not the norm, but the exception. Shifting the burden of proof is radical and is not universally accepted, nor is it clear when it would be appropriate. And this has left the process of decisions around restitution with severe unresolved tensions. And that takes me to my fifth point. In the debate around decolonization, restitution, and repatriation, the status quo is contested as the outcome of a historically inequitable distribution of power. From this flows that institutions faced with claims would lack legitimacy. Some may not even accept the laws of the country where an object is held as a legitimate part of the decision-making process. In 1997, Jürgen Habermas and Niklas Luhmann jointly set out their separate views of how we as human beings in society manage meaning, communication, consensus, and dissent. We may now find ourselves in a situation where consensus is neither achievable through something like Luhmann's legitimacy through process, nor through Jürgen Habermas' zwanglose Zwang des besseren Arguments. One way of reducing this gap in legitimacy is to remove the right to decide about their property from certain owners and to create a body which decides about the future ownership, as we have seen for objects from the Nazi period. These processes are perhaps imperfect, but that should not deter us from seeking to improve them, nor to find other better models for addressing this gap of legitimacy. My final element, which creates a field of tension, is about the impact of decisions to return. When facing a claim for return, we deal with actions which happened in the past, but we act in the present. The ethical status of our decisions now must be judged by their impact today. That may be relatively simple if we return an item to private owners. Much more complex is the return of an item to a modern state, which now controls the territory from which an item was inequitably removed. The claim for return to a nation can be based on issues of cultural identity, but national identities can be manufactured and are often fictitious. The current Russian national identification with the ancient Scythians is a case in point. A return of an item to a state will nearly inevitably be part of a cultural political program, and it can be part of a more or less unpleasant form of identity politics. A European library has an important collection of Uyghur manuscripts, probably bought in marketplaces in the early part of the 20th century, and therefore they do not meet the standards of proof required by Sarr and Savoy. How would we feel about a return to the country now in charge of the Uyghur regions, widely accused of cultural and physical genocide, and where the return would most likely be part of the state's oppressive policy? This may seem easy to answer, but in all cases, a return has its impact on the political situation of today, not on the past situation which we seek to address. There is an argument, if you cede a contested item, it's not up to you to make judgments about how it's going to be used. That's obviously true when we deal with individuals, but you can't simply equate individuals and states. They are inherently different entities. Doing so would, in my view, let us off an ethical dilemma too lightly. We can't be absolved that easily from the effects of our actions today. Yet I know of no entity which has openly confronted this ethical aspect to restitution claims fraught with moral, reputational, and political issues. There will always be divergent opinions in a free society. Their peaceful coexistence is not facilitated by concepts which are or seem to be inconsistent, even contradictory in some important respects. Nor does it help that sometimes it seems to be inadequately thought through what impact the concepts may have beyond the immediate situation they were meant to deal with. Without greater conceptual clarity, the risk will grow, on the one hand, of concepts becoming inappropriately applied beyond the arena for which they were intended, while on the other hand, decisions will continue to seem unsatisfactory, even illegitimate, to claimants, to those who possess claimed objects, and potentially to a much wider public. Thank you.
Kristian, thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes for questions. So what we'll do is, if you'd like to ask a question, please just raise your hand, and Antje will launch a microphone in your direction. And also the questions are open on the chat as well. So we have questions in the room. All the way at the back. This is a test of strength.
Yes, okay. We can have both on.
Thank you. Okay, does this work? Okay. Thank you. I thought that was fascinating, really, really interesting. So do you believe, though, that one of the advantages of poorly defined concepts, and I agree that many of the ones you've highlighted are quite poorly defined, is that offers wider scope for interpretation and offers the opportunity for them to change over time as society changes, because we have no chance of bringing in multiple new laws every time society changes its mind on something in a global sense. So the lack of clarity, at least, offers potential for use over time.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really interesting and possibly the most difficult question you could ask. I think that in terms of changing attitudes, it's clear that that the law just cannot follow changing attitudes. There is, however, also a concern: should the law follow the attitude of the day, or is there is, I mean, I'm now not talking generically about restitution, but more broadly, or is the feeling of the moment something that it is very dangerous for the law to get involved in? So the person who's accused of somebody and is not liked by the sun, there's a great animus against this person, public opinion wants a conviction. How far, when does the law follow public opinion, and when does the law say, well, actually, no? So I think we need to have a degree of flexibility, and I think that the notion of reasonability is essential. But in order to apply reasonability, I think we need to know what we are talking about. So at least I think then we need to know, these are the concepts we are using. What are they meant for? Where do they apply? And if we do this, what are the consequences? And we can then have a good idea of what the consequences are, because we have analyzed the tools which we're using.
We have a question. Some items are acquired in good faith at the time, but later have issues that come to light. Does in good faith carry any legitimate weight in a claim?
I think that probably depends partly on the legislature in which you're operating. and I would also suggest it partly depends on when. There is, if that's where the notion of due diligence that I think really kicks in. If something was acquired in good faith, but you are the sort of a person who ought to have known better, then I'm not sure that it should be given a lot of weight. And that's why I'm a strong believer in institutions exercising really severe due diligence and possibly erring on the side of caution. Because if you work in institutions, you jolly well ought to know. If when I worked in the British Library, had authorized something, and it turned out that actually with a few hours more research, we could have found out that there was a doubt here, then I feel culpable. If my aunt had done it, actually, my aunt is not a specialist in these things. It's more easy to say, okay, she didn't understand. So I think that there's a difference. One of the really interesting cases where this type of excuse has been used has been the Museum of the Bible in Washington. Where there's been a lot of acquisitions where they said, oh, well, we were new in this field. We didn't know about the rules. Well, actually, you're very rich. If you didn't know, you could have paid somebody. So I think that sometimes yes and sometimes no, and it depends on where you are, what legal weight will be given. And that, of course, is one of the other real problems of this, that you can shop around for legislation in which to act. It's easier for you to achieve restitution in a US court than in a Swiss court. So.
And also we have a chat participant who is very eager to know, where is this lovely last great quack?
Oh, no, I've forgotten the shelf mark. It is a British Library medieval manuscript. And apologies, the British Library, I should have put the shelf mark on, and I have not, and I don't remember it. But thank you.
Thank you. As ever, Kristian, it was really thoughtful and thought-provoking. You talk a lot about lack of consensus, but I think in some cases there may never be a consensus. There may never be an agreement. For instance, decolonization, where people are, there are always going to be people who will say, well, this was legitimate according to the rules of the time, and there are going to be people who will say, well, the whole rules were wrong. So how do we proceed, do you think? How should we proceed where we never will be able to sit down and agree the basic principles?
Let's see. Not being a philosopher, I'm allowed to have my cake and eat it. I think that although Habermas's approach of the rational discussion is utopian and probably suits best for a Frankfurt philosophy common room environment, it is the only tool we have. So I think that we should go as far as we can along the route of an open, honest exchange of views to get as close as we can to the other utopian view, that we can have a shared view of legitimacy. So no, there will never be a consensus. And as I said at the end of my talk, I don't think that we should aim for that. If we live in a democratic state, we need to learn to live with a difference of views, but we need to accept one another's views, and that can only come through a complete an understanding that's sufficient for those who are concerned to be confident that this is at least following approaches which one can see, understand, follow, and disagree with. I don't think we should aim for universal acclaim, because hey, this is not Moscow.
We thank Kristian very much for this.